Hello. Oh, there we go. What's going on, guys? So, I thought today we could have a conversation about this old girl right here, my 1979 Volkswagen Rabbit. And I'm sitting down because I'm lazy. Last time you guys saw it, I think I had just gotten the crank out of the block and took it down to the machine shop, and it took me about 3 years to get to that point. So, the fact that we got it to a machine shop was pretty good, and I was optimistic that maybe it wasn't blown, but well, it was. The machine shop said that every cylinder is out of round and taper, which if you don't know basically means that the cylinder wall is supposed to be a cylinder, right? It's a cylinder, literally. And so the cylinder wall is supposed to be even top to bottom. If it isn't, then the piston ring won't seal on the outside of the piston, and you'll lose compression and drop off on performance, and eventually it gets to the point where the engine won't run. Usually that's considered just a totally ruined engine. Now you can fix it, and we'll get back to that in a minute, but basically right now I've got the engine here at the shop. I've got the block and the crank all soaked in penetrant oil to prevent them from rusting or corroding, and they're packed away because in order to fix those things, well, the crank is good, but the block would need to be bored out, and I need to get bigger pistons then because the original pistons wouldn't fit. Well, then you need new rings. Well, you might as well replace all the bearings in the bottom end at that point. Point is, rebuild the entire engine, all right? So that brings me to a bit of a conundrum because if you can't tell, I'm kind of frugal. This is my nice tank top, I'll just put it that way. I have like 4 tank tops and some t-shirts and some shorts and like some sandals and a pair of Converse and a bunch of cars. And that's pretty much it. So the thought of spending a bunch of money on an engine, like, it just blows my mind. For $2,500, okay, which is what it would cost to do option number 1, which is rebuild the engine that came in this. Not only would it take like 6 months, probably, because everything in here takes me 6 months, but it would be so much money that I could have the green Ford Fiesta, the Corvette, and the Honda N600 for the same price. Why would I spend that much money on an engine when I could diversify and have a lot more fun for the same amount of money? Well, it does mean getting this car back on the road, which is why we're here to talk. First thing I should probably address is, why am I saving this car? Why does it matter? Why not just part the car out, sell it, whatever? Well, honestly, first of all, that's kind of the equivalent of your friend walking up to you and going, man, I got a little heartburn today, and you just stab him right in the chest and you just start scavenging his organs right there on the spot. Like, I can't do that. If you're that kind of person, you can do that, that's fine, but I'm not that guy. And this really is an old friend of mine. The main reason I want to save it is because it's near and dear to my heart, and that is because of a trip that I took in the car from Oregon all the way back to Missouri in 2017? I don't know what year it is anymore. My friend moved to Oregon from Missouri, and he had about 2 weeks notice when he did, and he said, man, you got to come with me. We're going to go to all these national parks on the way. We're going to have such a good time, but you're going to have to find yourself a way back home. Well, with 2 weeks notice, if any of you have ever flown before, you know that you're going to pay out the bung for a flight, so I wasn't going to do that. Again, frugal. I thought, well, why don't I pull like a Top Gear, you know, and just buy some cheap car or a cheap moped and ride it all the way home and see if we make it. So I started looking at Craigslist. Wasn't necessarily looking for a Rabbit, but I had a friend in college who had a really nice Rabbit. I kind of always wanted to have one. And I know they're super reliable and bulletproof. Well, ignore the gaping hole in the engine bay. They're supposed to be reliable and bulletproof. I found this one on Craigslist in Ashland, Oregon, which is just north of the California border pretty much, for $1,000. And it ran and drove, and the owner said, well, it needs something done with the head gasket. He didn't know what, the shop didn't know what. Maybe it was down on compression, but it had 107,000 original miles. It was in pristine condition except for a little roof fade on the roof. Somebody took the foam out of the seats. I don't know why else you would do that unless you physically couldn't fit in the car. But other than that, seriously mint and not a speck of rust. So already I think it's worth saving because here in the Midwest, you do not get a rust-free Rabbit ever. All of the Rabbits here are in somebody's backyard, or they've had cows pooping on them for like 20 years and they're just totally rusted to bits. So to find one that doesn't have any rust here in the Midwest is really rare, and I think it makes it worth a lot of money. Plus, this is an early Rabbit, a German Rabbit, a 79, which means it has smaller taillights, the round headlights. It has other touches, including a different dash than the later cars. It's actually a pretty rare find in terms of Rabbits. So for those reasons, I don't want to just toss it away, but really for me, it's the sentimental value. The adventure that we had together, the bond that we forged, it's insurmountable. I mean, I would go so far as to say that I am a different person today because of the journey that I had with this car. And it just wouldn't have been the same in any other car. certainly not in like a Camry or something, but even in something like the BMW or the Ford, it would have been a totally different experience. I had people coming up to me on that trip saying, hey, I haven't seen one of these since my dad drove me down to the river when we were kids and I used to go fishing. We'd put our fishing poles in the back seat. I had another guy tell me, I used to have one of these in college. It was the same color, same four-door, everything. It was exactly this car. And now I know that wasn't his because this was a 2-owner car. It was, well, technically 3. A preacher owned it who drove it to church and back, literally like the ideal scenario. And then some kid got it in, I think, the late 2000s, early 2010s, and cut the springs and straight piped it. Actually, he just took the exhaust off. And then put like Stance Nation stickers on it and drove it all to all the wet dub shows and all that other shit going on in the Northwest. So that was kind of a polar opposites thing. And then the 3rd owner got it, and that was the guy I bought it from. And he had it for like, I think about a year. He drove it for like a month, and then he parked it and just never got back to it. So 2, I mean, technically 3 owners, but really 2, like, you know, using it owners. Point is, the memories I have in this thing are just incredible. I would not trade them for the world. The goal of this whole channel, the reason it's called Nowhere to Be, is because I want to do that kind of thing again. I want to take a trip in this, or in the Ford, or in the BMW, or heck, in the Corvette, I don't care, and go around, do car things once they all start happening again, but also go to national parks, go to roadside attractions, and show not only the beauty of cars, the beauty that, yes, you can inexpensively drive around in a vintage car and have a lot of fun, but also be able to go to all these free lands and camp out for free. I only stayed in one hotel that entire trip, and it was because the wind was so bad, there was no way to camp outside. And this, I think, is a prime candidate to do it in. It was really spacious, it was really capable. I got to some campsites that were up some roads that people kind of looked at me and said, you don't have 4-wheel drive, or you're not in a truck or a Jeep. And I like that. I like taking this thing where it's not supposed to go. So there's all that, right? Obviously, I'm not going to get rid of it because I have a connection to it. But also, Mama didn't raise no big quitter, all right? I'm not just going to give up on this thing. I'm not just going to throw in the towel the first time it has a problem. So we are going to see this thing through to the end. And that brings me to really the options. How do we get this back on the road reliably so that I can put a lot of miles on it, and without ruining the originality of it? The early Rabbits like this came with a 1.5 liter diesel. Okay, you could get gas too, but this one came with a 1.5 liter diesel. Now the 1.6, which came after that in the early 1980s, was largely just better in every way. I've heard from some people in the know who say that the 1.5 was just soft. It was not as well constructed as the 1.6. It had thinner head bolts that were inefficient in terms of their clamping power, so it was actually known, widely known even at the time, to have head issues, head gasket issues, warping on the head, coolant passages that would erode over time, which is exactly what happened to this. I suspect somebody didn't change the coolant often enough. Maybe that preacher just drove on the original coolant for 30 years. The other reason I'm wearing a tank top and drinking water like I'm a camel is because it's really hot in here. Like it's 1,000. Actually, let me show you. Let me show you real quick. All right, I've got my thermometer here, and if I show you this is my desk thermometer. If I show you the screen on here, you can see that it's actually 860 degrees in this warehouse. It's insane. And the humidity is 450%. I don't know how it happens, but ask Missouri. I don't know. How does it happen that this is like the hottest place on earth? I don't know. Death Valley, got nothing on this. So, option number 1, rebuild the engine to the tune of $2,500, and it probably takes, what, 6 months or something like that. That seems like a horrible idea for a million reasons. Not to mention scope creep. Like, where do you stop? Now you've got a fully rebuilt engine. Well, now let's do some suspension work. Let's do this and that. It could get out of hand really easily. Option number 2, I guess, going in terms of expense, would be what a lot of the Stance guys do, and they just buy a donor car. They go buy a really nice example like this that's got a really well-maintained engine, really good history on it, and they just rip the heart out. Again, I'm not that guy. I can't do that to a car like this. So that's kind of out the window. Plus, financially, again, by the time you rip the heart out and sell the rest of it, I have no use for the rest of it. I've already got a bunch of parts I'm never going to use, so I don't think that makes sense either. So that's number 2. Number 3, get some kind of like wrecked donor car. Kind of the same thing, but it's a little better. Find a wrecked car. Find a donor car that's been crashed, but it ran and drove when it was wrecked, right? Now, I did this with a Subaru. I got a Subaru Forester that had been T-boned. I swapped the engine into another car after confirming that it ran and drove, and that engine lasted 2 days. And yeah, there are a bunch of memes about Subaru, you know, knocks on roof of car, needs an engine again, whatever. And plus, I've only seen that happen once with a Rabbit, and it was down in Texas about 3 years ago. It was actually a Jetta, but he had a fully rebuilt engine, a Giles Performance fuel pump, which is a $900 fuel pump, and it got T-boned. He sold the car for $500. But that was one time, it was in Texas, and it was 3 years ago. So I don't think it's going to happen again. Now, if this were California, I would be spoiled for choice here, but my choices, I think, are getting smaller and smaller. So that brings us to the next option, which is to find a barn find, maybe something that's been sitting in a field for a while. Maybe something like that over there. I think that's a terrible idea. Honestly, let me just show you. Here, take a look. Come walk with me. I'll take you off the NASCAR tire. You've been sitting on a NASCAR tire, by the way. This is my 1981 Lago Blue 1.6 liter diesel. So it does have the preferable 1.6 liter engine. It's in a really nice color. It is a fairly complete car. It's got all of its parts except for a little bit of the trim, which on the early models is stick-on. It just peels right on and peels right off. Versus on the earlier models, it's actually hard and attached to the body. The main reason that I don't want to do anything with this engine is, well, just look at it. I don't know how well you can see this. Let me get my phone out. Boom, now we got a flashlight. It doesn't look that bad at first glance, but then you start looking at like that. You see how that wiper box there has a crack in it? Like, how long does it take for something like that to dry out? And you start looking at the engine mounts, they're all shot. All the gaskets are leaking. There's evidence of oil coming out of the air box, which is, in that quantity, never good. The fuel pump looks just totally frozen up and has a little bit of leakage going on that top line there. You're starting at square one with this thing. I mean, this is no better than just getting some engine off Craigslist and you don't know anything about it. This thing's been sitting for this long. I mean, look, there's wildlife growing on the grill here. Now, it's still worth something to somebody. I mean, it's still an original Lago Blue car. It's still in one piece. It's still complete. And it's got an engine. I mean, you could work with this engine, but I'm just not going to be the person to do it because, well, there's a high likelihood, I think, of putting as much money into that as I would into the engine that came out of this one. So I don't think that's a good idea either. The last set of options really isn't all that different. It's finding an engine off Craigslist or Marketplace or whatever that has already been taken out of a car, and it ran when I pulled it. You know, you get into that whole thing of, can you actually trust that it ran without any receipts or any like first-hand history of the engine running and driving? You don't really know what you're getting into. Now, that is the cheapest option by far, but it's, I still don't think a good one. As you can see, there's really no good option here. The only good option is to throw money at this thing, and I'm like, my soul is just against that idea. As much as I love the thing, I don't want to go bankrupt over it. And I also don't want to sell all this stuff just to put an engine in this. So here it sits in the corner of the warehouse. Yeah. Now, I didn't talk about the option of maybe swapping in a more modern drivetrain. You can get a more modern Volkswagen, a GTI or something, and you can swap in the drivetrain. I like that this car is fairly original. I mean, besides the damage that it sustained in the tornado and maybe a faded roof, and I lost these trim pieces in the tornado too. They were off somewhere in the unit and they're just gone. I do have the hubcaps. But this thing is in like phenomenal condition, I think, personally, having, you know, original mileage on it and being an original car. I don't want to take away from that by putting a modern engine in it and then doing this whole, you know, Stance Nation thing of just trying to make it ballin' or whatever. So that's kind of a little conversation about the Rabbit. That's where it stands. I don't know what the best option is, really. I don't know if there is a best option. And truthfully, I've been waiting for 3 years at this point. I think at the beginning I wasn't sure, or maybe I wasn't willing to believe that the engine was blown, but at least for the last 2 years, I've been keeping a good eye on Craigslist and Marketplace and people's driveways just looking for one of these things to take the engine out of, or looking for an engine that somebody took out when they were doing a swap. Hasn't happened. So I think I'm getting pretty close to just the next thing that happens, I'm just going to pull the trigger. I just hope this thing gets back on the road soon because I really do love it. It really did, I think, change me as a person to take that kind of trip. And I met lifelong friends that I never would have met if this car had not opened the door to have a conversation. Here's to doing that kind of trip again. Maybe it'll be in this car, maybe it won't, but that's the mission, that's the plan, that's why it's called Nowhere to Be. So see you guys next time. Habba-dabba-dabba-dabba-dabba-dabba-dabba-dabba-dabba.